Machines are the most useful invention of man. But when their period of operation ends, transport very often ends up just standing in so-called cemeteries. And this is quite a big problem. For starters, all this looks, well, let's say, not very pleasant. In addition, every vehicle left to stand for an indefinite period of time is harmful to the environment. Various chemicals left in transport go into the soil. There's often something to decompose inside the car. Of course, recycling exists, an effective way to get rid of transport. But it is not for nothing that there are still a bunch of cemeteries. Sometimes it is just expensive. But for example, in Sri Lanka, they decided to approach the problem of unnecessary vehicles radically. They simply dump buses into the ocean. And no, this is not a crime against nature, but a well thought out strategy, which we will tell you about today. Coral reefs are often called underwater tropical forests, and this comparison is not accidental. Incredibly complex and vibrant ecosystems occupy less than 1% of the world's ocean floor, but they are home to more than a quarter of all known species of marine animals. What you are looking at is literally a hotbed of biodiversity, which is a critical breeding, feeding, and sheltering place for countless numbers of fish, invertebrates, and other organisms that inhabit the underwater spaces. Imagine that reefs are home to, for example, about 6,000 of the 20,000 known species of bony fish. Moreover, one small reef can contain up to 300 species. In short, if coral reefs disappeared somewhere, our ocean would become much poorer. Along with this, a huge number of natural processes would be launched, capable of leading to the decline of even that which is on land. It is not for nothing that scientists say that in nature, everything is interconnected. Of course, with such a significant role for natural biodiversity, coral reefs could not but have high significance for humans. Since reefs are biodiversity, and humans eat fish and seafood, then underwater formations for them are a source of food and, of course, money that can be obtained for this food. To understand how rich reefs are in various living creatures, let's say this. 1 kilometer of a healthy coral reef can produce 5 to 15 tons of fish annually, and with proper management, even up to 40 tons. As a result, according to scientists, more than 500 million people on the planet depend to one degree or another on coral ecosystems, receiving food and work from them. In some countries, this dependence is critical. For example, in the Maldives, reef fish provides up to 77% of animal protein in the diet. This is a huge share that cannot be replaced by anything. In general, in developing countries, reefs provide 20 to 25% of the total catch. Of course, the value for people does not end there. Ask those who have ever dived underwater near coral reefs. Is it beautiful? The answer will probably be something like incredible. In fact, this is precisely why diving and snorkeling are so popular. Yes, all this would exist without coral reefs, but it would clearly not be so developed. And perhaps one of the most unobvious but incredibly useful functions of reefs is the protection of humans. Reefs act as natural breakwaters, absorbing the energy of storm waves and tsunamis, thereby preventing coastal erosion and protecting coastal communities and infrastructure from destruction. That is, with the help of reefs, people eat, earn, enjoy, and even escape from the riot of nature. Unfortunately, according to the UN, about 70% of all coral reefs on Earth are under threat of extinction, and 20% of them have already been completely destroyed with no hope of recovery. The first reason for this is rising ocean temperatures, which leads to the desaturation of corals. This process occurs when corals, experiencing heat stress, displace symbiotic algae that live in their tissues and provide them with food. Without these algae, the coral loses its bright color and begins to starve, which eventually leads to its death if the temperature does not return to normal. Where would it be without pollution from humans? Agricultural runoff containing fertilizers and pesticides cause a surge in algae growth, which chokes out the corals. In turn, various chemicals, household and industrial waste, as well as plastic waste and microplastics, cause direct harm to reef organisms. Well, where would we be without fishing? especially when people resort to methods that leave nothing alive underwater. For example, people use dynamite. It explodes, causing reef areas to simply fly apart into pieces. Of course, overfishing also plays a significant role, which, like everything excessive, is a favorite human tactic. It seriously disrupts the fragile balance of reef ecosystems. Reefs have a lot of problems, and those located off the coast of Sri Lanka are no exception. Reefs in Sri Lanka are one of the main magnets for tourists visiting the country. Beach towns such as Hikkaduwa, Bentota, and Unawatuna are known for their reefs, which are located close to the shore and are easily accessible for snorkeling and diving. In addition, as in many other places, local reefs are a source of food and income. And, of course, they're subject to the same problems as other areas with queen reefs. However, it is in Sri Lanka that another problem appears. Nature itself can ruin the jewel it created itself. In 2004, a tsunami occurred, the powerful waves of which not only damaged, but literally crushed and wiped off the face of the earth significant areas of Sri Lanka's reefs, especially in coastal waters. This event had long-term consequences, and years later, many reefs have still not been able to fully recover. It was in Sri Lanka that they came up with an amazing way to save the coral ecosystem. Yes, throwing old, forgotten, useless buses into the water, which without this are useless in landfills and do not bring any benefit. How do these vehicles even help in the situation with coral reefs? Well, first of all, let's remember that coral reefs are structures that are home to biodiversity. They are shelter, feeding grounds, and hunting grounds for many species. When a coral reef is destroyed by human impacts or by a tsunami, as happened in 2004, all the species that live in the coral reefs lose their habitat. This is where buses come to the rescue, because they are simply the perfect replacement for the coral structure. The complex structure of the bus, consisting of a frame, window openings, and internal cavities, creates many shelters for small marine organisms. This is very important, since the grinding fish and invertebrates need protection from predators and strong currents. The bus turns into a safe haven, a kind of underwater kindergarten, which promotes the survival and growth of a new generation of marine inhabitants. Over time, the first organisms begin to settle on the hard metal surface. These can be algae, bacteria, and various invertebrates. This initial stage is very important, as it lays the foundation for the development of a more complex food chain. As life develops on the surface of the bus, other species of fish begin to swim to the area, attracted by the new food source and shelter. Then, on the artificial reef created from the bus, biodiversity begins to grow rapidly. Until recently, this place was a lifeless sandy bottom, but now hundreds of different species have appeared and found their home here. The complex structure of the bus provides a variety of microhabitats. Some organisms prefer the shaded areas inside, while others live on open, well-lit surfaces. This variety of conditions allows a huge number of species to exist, from small shrimp and crabs to various types of fish and starfish. Artificial reefs, like their natural counterparts, attract larger fish species that hunt or rest there. This leads to the formation of a stable and complex food web, which is a sign of a healthy ecosystem. As a result, it all comes down to the fact that the buses can be submerged in places where coral reefs and shelters have been destroyed due to human impacts or nature, or in places where reefs did not exist before. In this way, it will be possible to increase the number of reef habitats on our planet as a whole. What about the corals themselves? Buses help with them too. The technology solves the main problem that corals face in damaged marine ecosystems, the lack of a suitable surface for growth. Coral polyps, the tiny organisms that build reefs, cannot attach to soft, sandy, or muddy bottoms. They need a hard, stable substrate to build their colony. The body of an old bus, carefully cleaned of all pollutants, provides an ideal and extensive base. Then, more and more young corals appear, which gradually cover almost the entire surface of the bus, standing on the bottom. As these polyps grow, they reproduce by bunching, creating colonies that gradually cover the entire surface, left on the bottom of the equipment. In other words, the reef begins to grow layer by layer. The complex shape of the bus, with its various planes and curves, allows the corals to grow in different directions and create more complex three-dimensional structures, which can eventually turn into a robust and extensive coral reef. It is this process that demonstrates the main role of buses. They provide a critically needed architectural base for the restoration of coral populations. Without such a solid foundation, corals would not be able to begin to grow in areas where natural reefs have been destroyed. Thus, old equipment is not simply disposed of, but becomes a foundation for new life, directly contributing to the restoration of corals and their long-term survival in the ocean. By the way, it can be said that using buses in this role brings several more advantages. For example, once-running vehicles create unique and interesting dive sites. Divers often look for unusual locations, and diving on an artificial reef made of buses can be an exciting experience. More divers, tourists, and everyone else who wants to see the underwater car park is a help to the economy of Sri Lanka, which mainly depends on various types of tourism. And, of course, it is worth noting that close attention to the bus coral reefs is a way to divert a huge number of people from the underwater formations created by nature. Less attention, less harm. However, real coral reefs are the best solution, because the replacement in the form of buses has one problem. Before sending the equipment underwater, it must be thoroughly cleaned. There is a chance that some kind of mistake will be made, due to which the vehicle can become a source of pollution. Fuel, oil, hydraulic fluids, batteries, and paints contain toxic chemicals and heavy metals that can end up in the water. This will poison marine organisms and pollute the entire ecosystem, which will negate all good intentions. Cleaning is still usually carried out thoroughly, because the usual implementation of bus initiatives is carried out by knowledgeable people, or at least those who have received instructions from knowledgeable people. Therefore, equipment on the bottom is still an excellent way to help nature. Despite this, the solution is not very common even in Sri Lanka, which lost a huge number of its reefs during the tsunami. The first wave of dumping buses was recorded in 2020. Then, near Trincomalee, about the 20th of December, emission vehicles were loaded. Then, they were delivered on a military vessel and lowered about 5 kilometers from the shore. Then, there were 2 more large operations. About 2 buses were recorded near Galle, another 24-inch, the Jaffna area in the north of the island, a total of 69 units of equipment. This is very little. The tsunami destroyed, but man continues to destroy the underwater hotspot of biodiversity on a much larger scale, and this is quite sad. But humanity has other options of what can be used as an artificial reef, and each of them can be compared in its unusualness with buses. For example, everyone knows that ships sometimes sink. Yes, it is far from a joyful event when a wreck occurs. However, sometimes people themselves sink old out-of-service ships that are standing unneeded. USS Ariska I, a huge aircraft carrier with a length of almost 275 meters, a veteran of the Korean and Vietnam Wars, was decommissioned in 1989. Well, instead of recycling it, it was simply sunk in 2006-inch the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Florida. It took 200 kilograms of explosives, after which the ship with a displacement of more than 32,000 tons sank to a depth of about 60 meters for 37 minutes. Since then, it has been dubbed the Great Aircraft Carrier Reef, as its enormous hull has become one of the largest artificial reefs in the world. It provides a vast, solid base for corals to grow and creates countless shelters for marine animals. And, of course, it is a magnet for divers. The USS Ariska has become one of the most popular diving spots in the world. Another ship, named USS Spegel Grove, was sunk off the coast of Florida. At first, the operation did not go as planned. The ship turned over on its side. However, after a few weeks, it was righted axis. Now it lies on the bottom and is a popular place for divers and home to corals and many species. Sometimes sinkings make a real show. For example, this was the case with N.Y.K, a frigate that was sunk off the coast of New South Wales in Australia. However, there was one peculiarity. Before the sinking, special structures were installed on board to attract sea life, and many passages were made for divers. But then the frigate was sunk, and during this action, thousands of spectators gathered on the shore. Press, bang, ship on the bottom. And then the whole story began, how Adelaide became the reason for the increase of biodiversity in the area, and there are plenty of such examples. Ships are deliberately sunk to the bottom all over the world. And not only large ships that have a certain status, but also relatively small watercraft. Any will do. They are an excellent home for corals and other marine life. But you know what? Not only ships and buses will do. This is clearly seen in the example of the Red Bird Reef, located off the coast of Slaughter Beach in the state of Delaware. Before the project began, the seabed off the coast of Delaware was essentially an underwater desert. The flat, sandy landscape lacked the hard surfaces and complexity needed for corals and other marine organisms to take hold and create habitat. As a result, the region was poor in biodiversity and could not support large populations of fish, which negatively affected local fishing communities. But then came 2001, and the Red Bird project began. The idea behind the project was to use decommissioned New York City subway cars, known as Redbirds, because of their distinctive red coloring. As a result, 714 train cars were dropped into the selected area in total, but no one stopped there, because why not? As a result, 86 completely unusual for this business, decommissioned tanks and armored personnel carriers went to the bottom. 27 tugboats and barges, which are already common for us, as well as 100,000 tons of concrete and 2 million tons of rock. Before sinking, of course, all objects were prepared. Fuel, oil, batteries, hazardous coatings, and other potentially toxic materials were removed from the equipment. The hulls were modified to ensure water circulation and the safety of divers, after which the objects were towed to designated places and carefully sunk there. The result of these actions was impressive. In the Redbird zone, the density of the food supply and the biomass of marine food have increased many times over. According to observations, over a period of approximately 2001 to 2008, the amount of food available to fish per unit of area increased 400 times compared to the previous sandy bottom. Around the new hard structures, settlements of bivalves, crustaceans, and small fish quickly formed, which, in turn, attracted large commercial species: grouper, flounder, mackerel, and tuna. The Redbird project also transformed the recreational and commercial picture of the region. The area with the reef has become the most visited off the coast of Delaware. According to some reports, more than 10,000 fishing parties come to the Redbird Reef annually. Imagine, the place has become so popular that fishermen steal each other's catch, and other states are turning to the transportation department with official requests for cooperation, expressing a desire to take part in the program and get their own rail cars to create similar reefs off their coast. Yes, cleaning and throwing almost any equipment underwater is a good solution for coral reefs. But if you use any other objects, you need to be extremely careful and preliminarily study all the nuances, at least in order not to repeat what happened in the last century off the coast of Florida. In the mid-972nd, the Osbian Rift was intentionally created off the coast of Fort Lauderdale. As part of the Brevard Artificial Reef Initiative, more than 2 million automobile tires were lowered to the seabed between 1972 and 1974, covering an area of approximately 14.5 hectares at a depth of about 20 meters. The goal was twofold: to utilize growing tire dumps and to create a solid substrate to attract fish. The technology for placement seemed simple. The tires were tied with steel or nylon staples into large bundles and lowered to pre-selected areas. The problem was in the details. The staples and fastenings corroded, and the tires themselves were sufficiently buoyant and subject to movement under the action of storm waves and currents. As a result, the beams disintegrated, and millions of individual ones began to move freely along the ocean floor. They were located near natural coral reefs, and during strong storms and hurricanes, they caused mechanical damage to natural structures and pollution of beaches. Biological colonization of the tires was low. For many species, the hard but mobile and chemically unsuitable substrate turned out to be unsuitable. Therefore, the project ceased to fulfill the promised ecological functions and acquired a reputation as an environmental failure. Since 2001, many years of cleanup efforts have been undertaken. A research program led by Nov Southeastern University has recovered the first batches of tires. Then, in 2007 to 2009, naval and army divers took part in the operation, removing tens of thousands of tires. In the following years, commercial companies and contractors continued the work. By September 2023, a total of 543,197 pieces had been removed, and an additional 747 large coral fragments were removed to preserve living colonies. In general, not everything that appears to be a solid substrate is suitable for the ocean. And of course, any undertaking that affects nature must be carefully planned and tested. Otherwise, good intentions can turn into negative consequences. Now you know. Subscribe to get more interesting stuff. We'll see you in the next videos.